Hello and welcome to this final series of videos. Most of the videos you've seen so far were recorded 2 years ago in December 2016, but I'm taping this in November 2018 because of recent changes in the US Supreme Court. So let's have a look at the judicial branch of the federal government, and first let's move from Philadelphia to Richmond in Virginia. Virginia is one of the original 13 colonies, and Richmond, one of the major cities in Virginia, is home to 220,000 people. So why should we care about Richmond, which is, compared to all the cities we've visited so far, a minor city? Well, because I'm going to tell you a tale of two judicial cases to explain the difference between the state system and the federal system. Let's have a look. So this is the 18th of July 2016 in Richmond.
Let's get to some breaking news from our sister station in Richmond. Earlier tonight, you can see protesters shut down I-95 South near the Belvedere exit.
Jam cams show the road is back open, but there's a significant backup. We're working to learn what happened to the protesters and how they got off the interstate.
So, protesters are blocking the interstate, blocking the road, as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. They blocked the interstate and they were charged with a minor offense, being pedestrians on a highway. That is, you are not allowed to walk in places where people drive cars. And they were sentenced to 5 days in jail. They pleaded guilty. How could they not? And this means that they got a reduced sentence. So, a very limited case. These people were staging a political protest in Virginia, and they were sent to a court. Now, let's take another case, also in Richmond, Virginia, a few months earlier. Here is Richmond Sheriff C.T. Woody Jr., and he had a disabled deputy who wanted to have a civilian job within the force. But that deputy was not recruited for the job, and he was later dismissed, fired. This deputy argued that he was being discriminated against because he was handicapped, because he was disabled. And this violated a specific law, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which is a US labor law that makes it impossible to discriminate against people on basis of their being disabled. Importantly, this is a federal law. So it was sent to a federal judge, which dismissed the case, which found that the plaintiff was wrong and suggested that the ADA requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations unless doing so would cause an undue burden. In other words, the Americans Discrimination Act does not make it mandatory for the sheriff to recruit his deputy in a specific type of jobs. This is not what the act said. So, in one case, we have protesters on the road violating a state law. In the other case, we have a sheriff being accused of having violated a federal law. These two cases happened in the same city at about the same time. Yet, one was tried by the state court, the other was tried by the federal court. So there are two systems of justice in the United States. And the state courts are by far the most important. 95% of cases go through state courts. And when you say state courts, there are actually several levels. So, for instance, if you walk on the interstate, as these Black Lives Matter protesters had done, you will be sent to a state court. But if you appeal, that is, if you want to challenge the decision, this will go to a court of appeal. then possibly to the state Supreme Court. So there are different levels. You enter at the level of the state courts, the first level, but then you can move up in the system: state courts of appeal, state Supreme Courts. So these are most of the cases. If you shoot someone in a state, you will be sent to a state court. If you steal, if you break a state law, you will be sent there. But there are also federal courts. These federal courts are described by Article 3 of the Constitution, which describes the structure of the federal system, and I'll have more to say about that later, and defines the jurisdiction of federal courts. The jurisdiction, the limits or territory within which authority may exercise. Because, as you can imagine, if you have state courts and federal courts, they have to know who is in charge in certain cases, because a person cannot be tried under the two systems for the same crime. So federal courts have a specific jurisdiction. I'll come back to that in a minute. And they form a complex system. That complex system is actually similar to what we've just seen about the state systems. You have district courts. District courts, 94 of them across the United States. Then, if you disagree with the decision of a district court, the decision will be sent to a U.S. circuit court or appeal courts, which means that it will be re-examined. And there are only 12 of them. And then, on top of the pyramid, there's one U.S. Supreme Court, which can review cases going from the federal system, but also from the state system. As you can imagine, the district courts are where most decisions are taken. Remember, this is only 5% of all trials in the United States, and yet in the district courts, you will find about 500,000 cases a year, as opposed to less than 100 for the US Supreme Court. So it's truly a pyramid, and it's narrow on top. So, what does the federal system do? What do the federal courts rule upon? Well, they rule upon cases affecting ambassadors, ministers, consuls, admiralty, controversies to which the United States shall be a party. That is, they deal with cases having to do with the Navy and the United States. If it concerns the United States, that's for a federal court, because of course a state court is about the laws in a state, not the laws of the nation. If there is a problem between two states, of course it's not going to be adjudicated in one of the states, because you can imagine how that would go. So if there's a problem between two states, citizens of two states, the states themselves, then this is a matter for the federal courts. And finally, if it involves the United States and foreign countries, it will also be sent to federal courts. And if you take all of that together, that's about 500,000 cases a year, which is a lot. And on top of that, you have the US Supreme Court. So the US Supreme Court is defined in Article 3, Section 1 of the Constitution this way: the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. In other words, the US Supreme Court is the only part of the federal judiciary system which is defined by the Constitution. The rest, in such inferior court as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The rest is defined by the US Congress, which creates the courts, which can change the number, etc. So the whole system, the whole pyramid that we've seen in the Constitution, the only thing which is defined precisely is the US Supreme Court. The US Supreme Court has 9 members. This is a recent photograph, but not the most recent photograph, because in the front row, the second person to the left is Anthony Kennedy, who retired in the summer of 2018. And this led to a heated battle at the US Supreme Court. But I'll talk more about that in the next video. So who are these people on the US Supreme Court? Well, there are 9 members. One of them is called the Chief Justice, but it doesn't have more weight than the others. And the other 8 are Associate Justices, and you should remember that names. 9 members, that's not in the Constitution. This is something of a tradition. It's been that way and it remains that way. But the President and the US Congress could change that. 9-4 is convenient because if you have 9-4, you cannot have ties. You cannot have an equal number of votes one way and the other. So 9-4 reduces the number of split decisions, although they happened in certain cases. So who are these members? Well, they are named for life, and this is crucial to understanding the US Supreme Court and its importance in the US political system. They are named for life. That is, unless they decide to resign or unless they are impeached. But otherwise, they can remain on the US Supreme Court until they die, which means that they serve for about 15 years on average. Now remember that the president can only serve for 2 terms, that is 8 years, while justices, on average, serve for 15 years. And recently, judges on the US Supreme Court have been nominated at younger ages. So that's up to now 15 years, but Neil Gorsuch, who was appointed to the US Supreme Court last year in 2017, Neil Gorsuch could serve for 35 years. There's nothing to prevent that. So only 9 members serving for a very long time, and each of them has a crucial effect on the way the law is interpreted in the United States. But you may say, what does the US Supreme Court do? Well, it's the last court of appeal for both the state Supreme Courts and the federal appeal courts. So if a case is undecided in one of the 2 systems, it will go, or it may go, to the US Supreme Court. It has also direct jurisdiction, but this is very rare. Again, about 100 cases since the US Supreme Court was created. So, it's a court of appeal. It's just a court of law, which begs a question. How does the Supreme Court, how comes the Supreme Court is part of the system of checks and balances if it is just one court of justice? Well, the key word to answer that question is judicial review, and this is something I'll be discussing in the next video.